Still joining me in the studio, I'm delighted to say, mainly because we locked the door, it's Philip Ingram. He's former senior military intelligence officer, but we've shuffled him out of his usual seat to welcome in another guest. Times columnist, former Spectator editor, Fraser Nelson joins us. A very good afternoon to you.
Great to be here.
Always glad to hear from you. You say you've got a new documentary because you did. We've just been talking about welfare reform, and you did a fantastic, really interesting, very nuanced documentary about the problems we've got with welfare, people being trapped in welfare. And I do want to get a little bit of your thoughts on that and where we are on that, because it's such a big topic today. But first up, though, let's talk about the new documentary you've got, which is very, very, very simply asking the question: will Nigel Farage be the next Prime Minister? Let's have a little look at the trailer.
Could be a moment of madness.
There's a new future PM doll, and there it is. It's sold out.
Or it may be a signal that the top job in government is actually within his reach. My name is Fraser Nelson. I'm a political columnist for The Times.
Also, he's doing a documentary on reform.
I want to look beyond the headlines and ask the people who might put him in high office why they'd support him.
Reform being this voice that, people can speak freely is attractive to young people.
Can a man who triggers such reactions really lead and unite the country?
The guy's a clown, he's a charlatan, he's a cheat.
And you've got what it takes?
I think so.
And how could he actually pull it off?
It's nuts, it's all got to stop.
Well, that's a little taste of the documentary. Fraser Nelson. First of all, was this quite a good fun documentary to make? Because I have to say, one thing Nigel Farage isn't is boring.
It was certainly a circus. Even tracking him down was quite difficult. So I went up to Hamilton in the by-election, where he's playing cat and mouse with the protesters. So for example, we were told, OK, Nigel will meet you outside this doner kebab shop in the car park. So we went there, and all the rest of the crews were there. And then the protesters got word he was going to be there. So then all the socialist workers or whatever come after. And then it turns out that was a massive decoy. He actually was in a brick factory somewhere else.
Right.
So even if you want to track him down, you need to go through this kind of choreography of the great Farage circus. But then that he was the dominant factor in that by-election. There were so many parties there, but he basically made it about reform.
Yeah.
And so that was a simple... Previously, the idea of reform doing well in Scotland would be unthinkable. But now Farage was basically making the conversation for him or against him. That was the question.
Well, indeed, look, we had a poll earlier this week suggesting that the party could easily win a majority of the next election. The MRP poll for YouGov, again, these are really detailed polls, over 11,000 people. They do all the extrapolation. They don't just say a flat swing of this amount would mean these constituencies would turn, turquoise rather than red or blue. They actually extrapolate, go into the numbers of the people, and they're saying that it is very, very likely that Nigel Farage's Reform Party could be the largest party at the next election. A lot of people talking about the prospect of a Tory coalition. I mean, I can't see the Lib Dems or Labour going into coalition with Reform, so who else would it be? How likely do you think, if you ask who will be the next Prime Minister in, let's say, the elections 2029, although it may be sooner at the rate this government is going, who do you think the next Prime Minister will be?
Well, if you go down to the bookies right now and want to place a bet, you'll find that Nigel Farage is the bookmaker's favourite to succeed Keir Starmer. Now, it's 4 years out, it's difficult to make any kind of prediction.
I mean, bearing in mind 4 years before last year's general election, no one was saying that Keir Starmer would be the next Prime
of course. So the wheel of British politics spins quite fast at the moment. So whatever seems to be the case 1 month tends not to be the case in 4 and 5 months' time. Yeah. But what I do in the film is try to look at the roots behind the roots. It's not so much about Farage, but why people are supporting him. Now, they are exasperated, to put it mildly, with the two main parties. They see in their communities, in their country, things are bad and they're getting worse. Now, a lot of them had thought that a change of government might help. But we did this focus group in Solihull, which isn't exactly classic reform territory. This is in the Midlands, this is sort of swing voters. And we had 10 people who hadn't quite decided how they were going to vote.
The Solihull would have been solid Labour territory.
Oh, well, once upon a time,
yeah.
Absolutely. But we know, for example, that the seaside towns, that Blackpool almost certainly go reform. But there's more to it than just simply despair. There is hope, there's aspiration, but most of all, exasperation. Now, and so the voters were saying, well, we weren't quite sure what Keir Starmer stood for, but we didn't think it was going going to be taking away your window fuel payments, taking away your benefits. Because right now, if you were to say, well, a year of Labour, what's he done? Most people could only point to those two things.
Yeah.
And I think, well, this is not the solution. This is not an alternative agenda. But the thing to remember is that we had a lot of abstainers in the last election. That wasn't apathy, it was anger. So that's one of the things we picked up. One of the biggest support sources of reform support are people who didn't vote last time, who are going to vote this time.
But of course, the trouble with being in office is you have an opportunity to disappoint the voters. Very easy. I mean, it's just with the Lib Dems. They went into coalition with the Tories, and they're the ones who were punished in 2015. Tories got a nice big majority for David Cameron, but it was the Lib Dems that were punished. If you go into whether it's majority government or coalition government as a party that's never been in office, well, certainly not for many very long time, you then risk doing things that people don't like. Because right now, one of the major criticisms I'm hearing from people who've been long-time Reform UK supporters and Nigel Farage supporters generally, all his various party incarnations, is that he's trying to be all things to all men and gone from having a very sort of quite a free market economic approach to, full-on lefty approach in terms of lots of policies, and actually that is not going to appeal to an awful lot of staunch Reform voters.
But it depends what basis you're looking at this. Now, one of the fascinating things I found out was that you could say to them, as we did, look at Farage's promises if they don't add up. He's promising massive tax cuts, he's promising more welfare.
But neither do Labour's and the Tories.
Well, exactly. I mean, Labour's got the massive black hole, they call it a deficit, the Tories had one too. But voters they think, well, nobody's sums really add up. But it's not as if they think Nigel Farage is going to fix everything. They think that he might smash a status quo which they think is failing them in their communities. So the idea of a demolition is quite attractive.
That in itself. Is that similar to what happened in America with Donald Trump?
Very
you didn't
similar.
have to like him, you didn't have to agree with even all of his policies, although his policies always polled better than Trump himself. But actually, it's just someone who would just shake it all up.
You don't have to like him, you don't have to agree with him, you have to see that he's a necessary corrective to a failed consensus. That's the idea.
That's very interesting. Now, the press release from Channel 4, it's on 8 o'clock tonight, there's this documentary, it's part of the Dispatches series, is a quote from Nigel Farage himself, which I think is such an interesting quote. Our biggest enemy between now and next year and those elections will be ourselves. Now, a lot of times he's been accused of being part of the problem, although also the solution, a bump in the polls, as soon as he said, right, I'm going to stand for the general election, we're aiming to be the biggest party in 2029. So many people at Westminster were laughing at him. I wasn't laughing. I was like, uh-oh, guys, you don't know what's about to hit you. But so much Reform's appeal, we're told, is about Nigel Farage. If Nigel Farage wasn't here tomorrow, or just decided, I'm done with politics, I'm out, would Reform UK just collapse into nothing?
Well, this is one of the fascinating findings we did in the poll that we commissioned. We asked this question. Now, this time last year, you might think, well, before Farage came along, Reform was nothing, so if he decides to quit, it will just collapse like a souffle, right? It's basically the Nigel Farage party masquerading as Reform.
Yeah.
But both the focus group and the opinion poll show that not to be the case. Reform as a brand is now getting serious cut through. People like the idea of a radical alternative based on restructuring the status quo. Now, the opinion poll we did showed that support for Reform would go down about 3 or 4 percentage points, but not that much. It would still be formidable. Still,
I mean, Keir Starmer makes a speech and it goes down by that much.
Exactly. So this is now more significance than simply Nigel Farage. This is the belief in there being a party of outsiders whose basic USP, whose selling point is that we haven't done this before. We're not the usual suspects. Yeah. Now, people like that idea. Now, some people we spoke to in the focus group say they'd be more likely to vote for Reform if it wasn't for Farage, because he is a bit of Marmite. Yeah. He brings with him a certain sort of divisive kind of politics. Now, that will work for some people, not for others. So some of the voters thought, well, I like the idea about Reform, but I don't quite like this kind of, some of the language he uses about culture, sometimes Muslim issues, gives some of them pause.
Yeah, except we've had people leaving Reform saying that he's not strong enough on these issues. But it's interesting, I think there's some of the polling you did and looked at about in terms of people, how they view him, whether he's the belief that he's a racist. But he's not saying anything any different to Keir Starmer now.
Well, no, there's nothing Nigel Farage has ever said or done that would merit the label racist.
No, I know.
But still, interestingly...
I've been drunk with him on many occasions. You'd think something might have slipped out, but never has.
I know.
Because it's not.
I went through a phase of following him down the country to see if he'd say something to a town hall when he thought nobody was listening that might be on the... Absolutely not. He doesn't have a racist bone in his body. But here's the thing. So 42% in the poll said he was racist, 42% said he wasn't. But when you look at who was saying he was racist, there were supporters of other parties, Labour, the Greens, the Lib Dems. Now, if you look at Donald Trump, it's exactly the same thing. Racist is the word that a challenger party's opponents will use to try to delegitimise them.
But that word, again, almost doesn't have any meaning anymore. I used to threaten to sue people who called me that on Twitter. Now it's just so common. Everybody's a racist. I mean, everybody's a racist now. So I think it's terrible that we've demeaned the importance of a horrible thing.
But here's the thing, it has a big effect because it tends to drive voters to the other party. So they think, hang on a minute, you're calling him a racist because he wants to control immigration.
But I
want to control immigration, you're calling me a racist. So this word actually serves, it doesn't really serve to contaminate, it doesn't serve to toxify.
That's changed. This is the same with the Democrats. They're in America, their attacks on Donald Trump were 4 years old, the voters had moved on, and how much does this tie in with what's been happening across the rest of Europe? Although we left, Nigel Farage is, instrumental in us leaving and voting for Brexit, 9 years ago this week. But how much does it tie in with that move? We've seen, Giorgia Meloni, we've got, AfD in Germany, we've got, the National Rally in France and in Sweden, everywhere we've seen the rise of parties often called far right. Now some are.
Some are radical left as well. Podemos in Spain and the Five-Star movement.
But the outsider parties coming in, particularly on the right, and disrupting.
It's the anti-establishment parties of left and right. Now they're doing very well all over Europe. And look at Donald Trump. He's the fundamental anti-establishment candidate for exactly the same reasons. People feel, for example, economically stagnant after 20 years in this country. Salaries haven't moved. The idea of progress is fading away. But here's the other thing. Demographic change is a major factor in all Western democracies, and the old parties don't like discussing it. And if they want to have important conversations about culture, about what your kids are going to do, about the economic model, then the new parties are willing to have that conversation. Now, if you say, you can't say that because you're racist, then you're driving people to the new party. So we are seeing right now, it's a kind of new consensus, but fundamentally it's pro-democracy. This is democratic process at work.
Absolutely. Well, this, again, I was saying earlier on the show, this is why I voted for Brexit. It's because I wanted democratic accountability. And again, if Tories were elected again and again on a promise of cutting immigration and tackling a lot of these issues, didn't do it, voters kicked them out. Labour made some of those similar promises. They ain't going to do it. And in my views, they will be kicked out. And hopefully at some point people will get that message. How much of this do you think is about the economy? Because, that old line, it's the economy stupid when it comes to people feeling poorer, not just feeling poorer, they are poorer, energy bills and all that. Again, I think net zero, that's a deal breaker for me, for any party. If people, how much is it about the economy and how poor people feel and worried about their economic future, and how much of it is, say, cultural issues like woke battles, DEI, the issues over cultural change in our cities as a result of mass migration from, say, the Indian subcontinent?
Well, I think the economic issue is the base of it. If the economy had been roaring for 20 years, we wouldn't have these problems. But on that base, you've got the idea of a social recession, which is more important. People can see the kind of the social capital of their communities and their towns fading away, and they hate it. But the other point we found in the focus group was that they feel themselves subject to that atmosphere. We had spoke to a 26-year-old guy who was a builder. He was saying, look, me and my mates, we have discussions, we make jokes, but we're living in a world now, if you say something on social media, your life is over, you get called a bigot. Now, every single person in that focus group, we're not talking journalists or people who are actively on social media, they felt that they were in a new world now where you can get judged and cast as a bigot for making some basic observations. They hate that, and they see in Nigel Farage somebody who stands up to this. So because he's a taboo breaker, because he says things that are outrageous and he doesn't care, they think, well, this is what we need to shatter They feel this is very real in their lives, that right now we're living in an environment where they could lose their job, lose their status, and they see in Reform the only party which will challenge this, not necessarily fix it.
And again, I think a lot of people, they think it's about sort of high-profile people who get castigated like J.K. Rowling or whatever, but actually it's happening on a grand scale and people are being silenced. I know some of you have done great work over the years trying to sort of shore up people's right to freedom of speech. Do you think that Nigel Farage, if he became Prime Minister, would be a good Prime Minister? Because one of the questions I've asked him recently is like, do you actually want the job?
Oh, yeah. This is a really big thing, because every time he gets asked this, he doesn't give a straight answer. He will try to answer, no, well, and this is important because he has all his life, he's been a campaigner, but he's never really positioned himself as a man who can run the Department of Health better than the other guys.
I can tell you what's wrong, rather than I can
And by the way,
right.
he's been the most effective campaigner in post-war politics. Look at what he's achieved.
He's the most influential politician of our generation.
But in the last few months, he's trying to repackage himself as a man of government. Now, people say, look, do you want to become Prime Minister? Here he is, in his early 60s. He was having a very nice life. And does he want, in 4 years' time, to be wrestling with this kind of beast that nobody else has succeeded in wrestling with? I'm not sure that he does. I'm not sure that his policies stack up, but he's got a good answer to that, Julia. He will say to you, well, I understand neither me nor any of my team have really run government before, but we've now got 10 local authorities. Soon we'll have a lot more. Judge us by the results. Come back, not in 4 years, but in 1 year, he's saying. That's a short time frame. So let's see if Kent Council, on the brink of bankruptcy, has managed to have their changes. Let's see if Zia Yusuf and his Doge team are able to make it. Because if they are able to turn around local government, why shouldn't they be able to turn around national government?
And there is a view, I think, from it ties in with what you were saying, if you're hearing some focus groups, that actually the last two lots have been so rubbish it can't be any worse, is what the voters
This is exactly it. He is the kind of break glass in case of emergency candidate. And the voters are very well prepared to break that glass. Because Starmer's saying, oh, look, if you don't like me, look at the Tories. They were saying, no, actually, we reject this idea that we need to choose between Tweedledum and Tweedledee. There is another one.
I mean, I no doubt at all that 16% in the polls, Kemi Badenoch, the Tory leader, she gets it. She knows the threat. Right now, we're looking at, one of the polls suggesting just 3 dozen MPs or something for the 3 or 4 dozen MPs for the Tories after the next election on the current polls. Do you think that Keir Starmer gets it?
I think that what Nigel Farage is doing right now is a great national service in dangling Keir Starmer over a political cliff by his ankles and asking him if he enjoys the view. Now, if Keir Starmer doesn't get it right now, looking at this MRP poll, looking at pretty much any other poll that's come out in the last couple of months, he'll be working out either he manages to address the concerns of these Reform voters, or they are absolutely prepared to replace him with Nigel Farage. Now, they're not joking here. This isn't something they tell opinion pollsters. They put Reform in government in 10 local authorities. So if Starmer hasn't worked it out by now, looking at the scale of his rebellion...
and bearing in mind, there weren't even votes in a lot of the counties where Reform would have done better because of those delayed polls.
Exactly. So he will have to ask, is the country serious? Could they really mean it? Would they put Farage and a bunch of neophytes in if I don't deliver? The answer to the question is yes. Absolutely they would.
Absolutely fascinating. Philip Ingram's listening to all of that. What do you make of it?
Fascinating. Well, I don't think Keir Starmer realises he's been dangled over the cliff, and that's part of the problem. And it's great to see that disruptors are having so much influence across the place, but our traditional political parties, and this is probably the same across Europe and elsewhere, don't know what to do, so they take out their old recipes and they just apply the same recipe again.
Also, part of the issue is they don't really think that mass immigration is a problem. For instance, they don't really think that a lot of the things that we think are massive problems are a problem.
Or they think their hands are tied and they can't really solve it. When they can, there are lots of solutions which they just simply won't reach for.
Because they want to be the nice people.
Mainstream parties are disassociated from reality. Labour is losing it in exactly the same way that the Tories lost the last election, and they're doing nothing about it. In fact, they're making it worse for themselves.
Yeah, it is absolutely fascinating. Let's go back to welfare reform, because I mentioned, Fraser Nelson, your last documentary was about welfare and how a lot of people, it was classic, because there were some Labour backbench MPs going, well, I wouldn't watch the documentary because, I know his stance, his Spectator editor, it's going to be, it's all, bashing the poorest. And in fact, it was the opposite of that. It was an incredibly sympathetic portrayal about how people get trapped on benefits, particularly disability and other benefits. What do you make of the government's bid to these welfare reforms? I mean, they're in my view, a drop in the ocean, but it looks like there's going to be a watering down of it. Do you think that the Prime Minister's got the right idea or not?
No, I think this is the mother of all missed opportunities, this. I mean, you've got one shot to change welfare. And what this does is it doesn't change. This is about saving lives more than saving money.
Yeah.
But all this does is it saves money and it doesn't save lives.
Yeah.
If you look at the projections, they're still expected to go up from 3.5 million on sickness benefit to 4.1 million in a few years' time. That's like the working age population of Birmingham going on sickness benefit under the existing reforms. Now, they won't be getting quite as much money, but still, when you look at the loss of talent, the loss of manpower, the damage to communities, all of that continues.
The damage
just
to
as
people's
bad.
mental and physical health. Not working is really bad for you.
And I don't think we've done nearly enough work into working out what happens when work disappears. The kind of social, the psychological, the kind of family aspects of it. And this is going to happen on the calamitous scale, even if these reforms are passed. So they should have done it by reducing the caseload, even freezing the caseload. But instead they've got reforms which, by their own projections, will massively increase the caseload, except make these guys even more miserable position than they were going to be already. So you'd think that a Labour Party, clues in the name, would do something that would take people off welfare back into work. This does not, and it deserves to fail, I'm afraid.
Well, there you are then. He said it. Thank you very much, Fraser Nelson, Times columnist. Really appreciate you doing it. It's absolutely fascinating. That documentary's on Channel 4 tonight, dispatches, 8 o'clock. But